It's good to see, actually, from having scrolled down the name of participants earlier, a few names that I recognise on there. So thank you for dialing in, as it were, today. And also for those of you that I haven't met before or haven't had an interaction with, welcome. And I hope you enjoy some of the topics that I'm going to pick up on over the next half hour or so as we go through just a very brief overview of sort of some of the relationship that humanity has with infectious diseases. So just to sort of put that in context, the original title of this talk was one that I picked up on last year as part of our summer program. It wasn't actually one that fed out from the coronavirus pandemic, although obviously I will touch on that a little bit later on. My own background is in infectious diseases, so I actually have a PhD in molecular virology, having studied a number of years ago now, but a group of viruses that were very closely related to HIV. I then spent about 15 years in a research career looking at the way that the body recognizes infection, how it responds to it, how it picks up on invasion by bacteria and viruses. And then over the last 3 years or so, I've sort of moved into the Institute, and I lead on the oversight and development of the courses in the biological science areas. So at the moment, I will be asking for the slides to be advanced. For some reason, there was a technical issue sharing from mine, and so they're being hosted by the ICE team. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So I just want you to have a little think, actually, as I start to get going, about what you as an individual think the 3 top global killers might be. Not just in terms of infectious diseases, but just any sort of disease, condition, accident, event that may lead to large-scale death across the world. Next point, please. So the last point on that slide that's up at the moment was to get you to think about animals and what the 3 most deadly animals worldwide were. So hopefully you've all had plenty of time to think about these questions now. And Corey, if you could advance the slides for us, please. Okay, thank you. Now, this is just an image that really tries to put into context the different sort of level of danger and a level of fatality that different animals can have. Quite often when asked this question of people, we hear about sharks are mentioned as being dangerous animals, and yes, they are, but actually at a global death level, they cause very few deaths on an annual scale, and in fact they're much less dangerous than things like the dog, and often it's sort of suggested that the human is the most dangerous animal around, and yes, we are a threat to one another at various times, and a lot of recent events have highlighted some of those occasions. But actually, in terms of sort of the impact on global mortality, it's the mosquito that's the most dangerous of all organisms from the animal world. Have the next slide, please. And the reason for that is all about infectious diseases. So it's not that the mosquito itself tends to cause large levels of death by its own physical role or its own physical behavior, but it's about what it carries in its salivary glands and what it carries and passes on when it bites somebody. So these 6 diseases that are on this slide here, they are all infectious diseases. Malaria and elephantiasis are parasite diseases, and then the others, Zika, dengue, West Nile, and yellow fever, are all examples of viruses. You'll see from the numbers that the level of infection in terms of the number of cases that people see in these diseases are vast, and they have the potential in all cases to cause fatal infections. Malaria in particular has a high rate of fatality associated with it. So yes, the mosquito is a threat to the human race in many ways, or at least to human health. But the reason it is that threat is because of the infectious diseases that it can pass on. Next slide, please. Now, again, when you were thinking about those questions right at the start, I would imagine that a number of the conditions on here, heart disease, which is the top one, stroke, things like diabetes, things like tuberculosis, potentially, infections like pneumonia, which is what the lower respiratory tract infections are. Conditions like those, I would imagine, were probably on the list that you were thinking about. This is data from 2000 on the left-hand side and 2015 on the right. And it just highlights how that, although there's been some change in the global killers, actually it's a lot of the same conditions and a lot of the same infectious agents that are important in this sort of process. And if I could just have the next part, please, Corey. And the point that I want to sort of drive home here really is that even in 2015, infectious diseases still contributed a large proportion of the global deaths. So yes, things are improving. HIV and AIDS was no longer in the top 10, but those other conditions, lower respiratory disorders, such as pneumonia, diarrheal diseases, so that includes things like cholera, and then tuberculosis, all still major killers on the worldwide level. So the infectious diseases are a big, big problem. Next slide, please. Okay, and if we just bring up the next bit too. And then what we see here is that actually the data from the last slide masks some of the actual impact at the global level of infectious diseases because it's aggregating and averaging information across every single country worldwide. If we split those countries into those that are classified by the World Health Organization as high income on the left-hand side or low income on the right-hand side, then we see a dramatic change in the impact of infectious diseases in those populations and in those countries. When you look at the high income diseases, essentially, if you take out pneumonia as your lower respiratory conditions, then all of the other top 10 killers are either chronic conditions or they're cancer related or they're heart disease related. But that is not the case in the low income countries. There, you can see from the highlighted regions, half of that top 10 are caused by infectious diseases. And so when one looks at the global burden of death from infectious diseases, they are extensive and expansive, but they are not spread evenly across the whole world. Next slide, please. Okay, so one thing to bear in mind when looking and thinking about global mortality and the threat from infectious diseases is that they are not diseases that necessarily target the same populations. All mortality data, whether that's looked at a country level or at a global level, tends to follow this bimodal distribution where you get a massive peak in deaths in the under fives, and then gradually with age, you get an increase in the amount of deaths until you reach a point where actually the number of surviving individuals is lower, and therefore the absolute number of deaths starts to drop again. But anytime you see data on life expectancy or data on mortality, you need to bear in mind that actually it's presenting data where you have this big peak from the under fives. And so we'll see in a minute, I've got a slide that looks at life expectancy across the globe. And again, this sort of influences the type of data that we will see. Have the next slide, please, Corey. So within that under 5 population, actually, they are particularly susceptible to infectious diseases. And that is even more true in the developing world, in the low income world. So the data from a few slides ago with the comparison between the high income and the low income mortality rates in the top 10 killers, that was skewed in particular by the number of under 5s who would die from infectious diseases. So this slide here, it's from a website called Our World in Data, and a number of the bits of information that I'm putting across today come from that organization. It's run out of the University of Oxford, and it looks at all sorts of elements of global health. Not all of them are disease related, and it presents a lot of the data in relatively accessible formats. So I can definitely recommend, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about these areas, going to have a look at their website. But this slide just reiterates that actually, around half of all deaths in the under fives come from infectious diseases. Now, the absolute numbers have dropped dramatically over the last 20 or so years, or the last 30 years in particular. If you look back to 1990, there were about 6.5 million children dying every year from infectious diseases before the age of 5. By 2017, that number was only, I mean, it's still massive, but it was only just under 2.5 million. But these are all diseases that come from some form of either viral, bacterial, or parasitic origin. And so they are things that actually, in many cases, would be relatively easy and straightforward to treat. Next slide, please. But things are getting better. So this just plots the number of deaths for 5 of the major infectious diseases in the under 5s over the last 25 or so years. And yes, there are 1 or 2 areas where we get increases for a while. So malaria and HIV and AIDS, both between the 1990s and 2005 showed gradual increases, but they are now coming down. And that's partly due to improvements in drug treatment and accessibility. It's partly to do with education policies. It's partly to do with informing people how to stop transmission routes. But then when we look at the low respiratory infections, the pneumonias, things like measles, and also diarrheal diseases such as dysentery and cholera, all of those are falling. And so we see that actually your risk now as an under 5 of dying from one of these diseases is dramatically reduced compared to what it would have been like even just 30 or so years ago. And if we go back further in time, then the number of deaths through things like pneumonia and diarrheal diseases was significantly higher. Next slide, please, Corey. And if you just advance, that's it, thank you. So this is just playing an animation essentially off our Wilding data that looks at life expectancy. It started at 1850 and it will run through to the present day. The redder the color, the lower the life expectancy, and we'll see a shift towards green and blue as we get nearer and nearer the modern day. I'm going to pick up on a moment in some of the reasons behind this change. But again, this is caveated with the fact that we have that split in the distribution of deaths between the under 5s and then the older population. So you can make quite a big difference to life expectancy by looking at interventions that reduce the mortality in the under 5s. And a lot of those are targeted at infectious diseases. And that's one of the major reasons why we've seen such dramatic improvements over the last 20 to 30 years in particular in life expectancy. Many children who are born nowadays in the high income countries may expect to live for 100 years or more. Okay, once it hits the end this time, Corey, we can advance it. Thank you. So there are 2 main reasons why we've seen that improvement in life expectancy: the provision of clean water and the process of vaccination. These are widely touted as the 2 most important public health advances and interventions that the world has ever seen. Clean water is the most dramatic because it has such a wide and profound impact on all types of infectious diseases. And vaccination obviously has the benefit of being able to specifically target certain diseases and at-risk populations, and has been highly successful in targeting some of the main killers across the global perspective. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm just going to use 2 examples to highlight the importance of both of these techniques, and in a way to demonstrate how they actually came into widespread application in a public health perspective. So if you think about the provision of clean water, there are many parts of the country that still don't have regular clean water, and that is a big problem, and that is part of why the low-income countries still have a high number of deaths from infectious diseases. But if you go back 200-300 years, then actually clean water was not something that many people actually had regular access to. And back in the 1700s, there was a series of outbreaks of cholera, which is caused by a bacteria in London. And a doctor at the time, John Snow, was trying to work out where his patients were coming down with the infection. So they didn't know it was caused by bacteria, but he was suspicious that they might be exposed to something in their environment or in their workplace that was causing them to get ill. And essentially, he interviewed and he talked to all of his patients to try and find things in common. The map in the bottom right-hand corner shows where his patients were. Those are the red dots. The bigger the dot, the more patients in that area. But what he couldn't do was, track them all back to a particular workplace or track them all back to, visits to a particular shop or a particular, building. But what he did do was he discovered that they were all generally using the same water pump for their water supply, for their clean water. And this was located in Broad Street. And it turned out that there was actually a cholera infection within the pump, so that every time somebody got water out of this, they were collecting water that contained the cholera bacterium. They would drink it, and therefore they would expose themselves to potential infection. So he got the local city council, as it was at the time, to shut the pump. And that immediately stopped the spread of the cholera epidemic. And it was that first step really in the use of sort of epidemiology as a tool for mapping infections and infectious diseases. Next slide, please. Vaccination, that's something that was around for a long time without being understood, I suppose. That might be one way of describing it. So there's plenty of evidence out there in historical documents that show that on the Indian subcontinent and in China, vaccination was happening a long time before Edward Jenner started his process with treatments for smallpox. But their mechanism was the same. So I'll sort of wrap the two together really just to explain what happened. So Edward Jenner had observed, just like doctors in India and doctors in China had, that certain individuals tended never to get ill with smallpox. Now, smallpox was a very easy disease to recognize because it had these characteristic pustules, but it was also highly transmissible and in many cases highly fatal. And those who did survive were often scarred for life afterwards. However, Jenner's observation was that milkmaids who were actively involved with milking cows used to get a similar looking sort of disease on their hands, but they would never appear to come down with smallpox itself. And so he wondered if there was something in or about this infection or this disease on their hands that was protecting them from getting smallpox. And so what he did was he took a sample of the pussy material out of these pustules on the milkmaid's hands, and he actually put it into the son of his gardener. So he cut the young boy's arm, he put some of this pus into that cut, and then he sent the boy back home. Now, obviously, ethical approval was somewhat different back in Edward Jenner's time than it is nowadays. You would never get approval for a study such as that. Also, his number of samples was obviously somewhat limited. What he did then, in a way almost to make matters worse, was he then took some pus from a person with smallpox, and he did the same thing to the young boy and deliberately infected them with smallpox. Fortunately, Jenner's hypothesis was right in that the material in the cowpox infection, which is what the milkmaids had, was protecting against smallpox. And so the young boy didn't get ill. And this was the start of what we now know as modern vaccination, where Edward Jenner used to go around deliberately infecting people with small amounts of cowpox so that they would then be protected from getting the more severe smallpox disease. Come to the next slide, please. And that whole principle followed up the idea of vaccination. And what we see is the concerted and driven worldwide application of a vaccine has the potential to eradicate a disease. Now, smallpox has been eradicated from the global population. The last known natural case was back in the late 1970s. And that was done because the World Health Organization decided that it would support a vaccination strategy around the whole world. And that actually, in the case of smallpox, the virus is very stable in terms of its genetics and it doesn't change much. So once you have protection, protection is lifelong. The other disease that has been essentially eradicated through vaccination is rinderpest, which was a cattle disease. And then on the right, there's just an indication of how helpful and how useful vaccination can be in terms of reducing cases and particularly reducing mortality from a wide range of infectious disorders. We see, for example, people who've been vaccinated with measles, we see 100% reduction in deaths. Pertussis, which is whooping cough, which is a bacterial infection, a 99.7% reduction in deaths. Vast numbers of people's lives who've been saved through vaccination against infectious diseases. Obviously, at the moment, vaccination against coronavirus is something that we hear a lot about in the news, and I'll pick up on that shortly. I can have the next slide, please. So, should we be worried? We hear, nowadays regular reference to a wide range of infectious agents. Some of these are listed here on the left, but it's not an exhaustive list. Obviously, at the moment, we are more acutely aware of the threat of infection than probably most of us have been during our lives. The impact on our lives, on our own health and well-being, and the health and well-being of those that we love and care for from the coronavirus pandemic can't be underestimated. It's something that we need to take note of, and it's something that we need to respond to. But it's not the only virus, it's not the only pathogen that has over recent years been of threat or remain a threat to the global population. If you take something like tuberculosis or TB, it's estimated that about a third of the world population are infected with TB. Now, for many people, that's not a problem. Their bodies are able to keep it in check and it doesn't cause any issues whatsoever. But for people who are maybe unwell for other reasons, or become malnourished, or pick up some form of additional infection, it can suddenly lead to all sorts of problems. And we hear about antibiotic resistance to bacterial pathogens as well. That's a growing concern. Next slide, please. If we think about the global threat from all sorts of sources, not just infectious diseases, every year the World Economic Forum put together their perception of global risks. And this is based off a survey of members, and they assimilate all of this data and they create plots like this. So this is from the most recent survey, which came out earlier this year. Now, the survey itself is based on data that I believe is collected towards the end of 2019. And so therefore was done before we had the coronavirus outbreak. I am suspicious that people's responses may have been slightly different if they were asked now as to what they feel the risks are. But the blue circle on that diagram goes round infectious diseases, which was perceived to be of slightly lower than average likelihood of happening, but slightly higher than average impact if it did happen. There are lots of other things that represent global threats. We have cyber attacks, we have weapons of mass destruction, we have climate action failure, we have natural disasters. There are lots of things that can have global impact, but infectious diseases is one of those elements. Next slide, please. And when you look at the ranking of risks in terms of their likelihood and in terms of their impact. And again, I think infectious diseases will now on the likelihood come higher up the list, but that impact is there in the top 10. And I think the experience that the world is having at the moment reiterates how much of an impact those infectious diseases can have on the global level. Next slide, please. So just picking up from where I was. So that had a list a couple of slides ago of nearly a dozen different infectious diseases that come into the news relatively frequently as potential outbreaks, potential pandemics, potential risks to the population. And what I've got here is just a very short video clip. Yeah, so this just runs through some of the major pandemics that have been over time. The key ones really to flag up are the Black Death from the Middle Ages, which was the biggest killer in all of pandemic history, with about 200 million deaths. We have the influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu from the 1918 to 1920, which again, 40 to 50 million people killed in that. And we have the HIV/AIDS epidemic, actually, which people don't often think of as a sort of pandemic-based infection, but this is an infectious disease that has killed, in the region of 35 million or so people, and has a death toll that will continue to go up. And then at the end here, we have a number of smaller dots, but they pick up on some of the threats that there are now to us. So we have Ebola outbreaks, we have the swine flu outbreaks, we have the previous coronavirus epidemics, which were contained and which haven't had the impact that the current one has. And we see, and this is data that's up to date until a couple of days ago, the current COVID-19 pandemic, where at the moment we have over 400,000 recorded deaths. And obviously the impact of that is only going to increase at the moment. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So why is zoonotic infection such a problem, and what is a zoonotic infection? So a zoonotic infection is a virus or a bacteria or a parasite that has its natural life cycle in some form of animal species, but that for whatever reason it becomes able to jump into humans and cause infections in humans. The reason that they're a problem is that normally we don't have any immunity to these infections. They're not ones that we've seen before. Our bodies don't have a defense against them. And also we're not the natural hosts. And often when an organism isn't a natural host, infections tend to be more robust and tend to be more frightening in nature, and quite often will have higher fatality rates. Okay, next slide, please. I'm just going to very, very quickly just pick up on 2 or 3 of those pandemics and give a little bit of information on them, and then I'll take some questions before too long. So the Black Death through the Middle Ages in Europe, as I said already, it's the biggest pandemic that has been historically. It wiped out about 1/3 of the population of Europe at the time. And so, the impact, both at an individual and a personal level, was vast, but also the impact that it then had on the sort of the rebuilding and the redevelopment of the infrastructure and society at that time was also dramatic. It was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which is found on rodents, and it gets passed on in the bites of fleas. So they pick it up from rodents when they feed on those, and then if they jump onto a human and bite them, the bacteria is passed on into the bloodstream. There are 3 types of plague. The worst ones, pneumonic plague and septic plague, are 100% fatal if they're not treated by antibiotics. Obviously, in the Middle Ages, there were no antibiotics. So a large number of the individuals who got infected with those 2 forms were killed. And the bubonic form is probably about 40 to 50% fatal in most cases. Next slide, please. HIV is, as I mentioned a moment ago, a long-running pandemic. The infection first arrived in humans probably in the 1950s, transmission of a closely related virus from chimpanzees somewhere in Africa. And with time, it has developed and it has mutated into a virus that is optimized now for infection and survival within humans. There is no treatment that will eradicate the virus from an infected individual. So there are lots of drug treatments that help to control infection and help to suppress the virus, but none of them are capable of actually clearing infection. And the virus has a very high mutation rate. And this is one of the reasons why it hasn't been possible so far to develop a vaccine against HIV. A lot of the reduction in infection rates of HIV have come from improved education practices to educate individuals to stop transmission. So advocating for safe sex practices, advocating for needle exchange programs and that side of things. Next slide, please. Thank you. Influenza, again, this is one that linked with the coronavirus we've heard a lot about, and it's a disease that we come into contact with every single year. There are many different strains and types of influenza that circulate on a global level. And if you look at the annual cycle of influenza infections, they normally tend to start in the Far East, they move down to Australia, and then they move across to Europe, and then over to the Americas, sort of mirroring the movement of the seasons. It's a winter-based disease predominantly, partly because the virus survives better in the winter, partly because people are inside more during that time, and transmission is more likely. The majority of influenza that we encounter at the moment is what we would call pseudo-pandemic, I suppose, in that it happens on a global scale, but it's more epidemic in nature, in that it's localized spread and infection. The real risk from influenza is the fact that it has versions of the virus that will infect humans, birds, and pigs. And because of the way the virus is constructed, its genetic information is split into different fragments. And if a virus from a bird and a pig happen to infect the same animal, and that's possible because of the way the virus works, those fragments can get mixed together. And then you can end up with essentially a new flu virus being created. And when that happens, often we don't, as humans, have an immune response against that. And so it becomes very, very difficult to mount an effective immune response. And that's what's happened with things like the Spanish flu, and with things like the Hong Kong flu in the 1950s. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last couple of things that I want to pick up on just relate to coronaviruses and the SARS outbreak. So while I was preparing the slides for this, I came across this image, and it was only when I looked a bit more closely that I realized that it was from 2003. So it was from the original SARS and coronavirus outbreak. And I think the writing on it is telling in a way. It uses the phrase, the new age of epidemics. And I think if one looks back over that sort of, whatever it is, 17-year period now, it is apparent that we are probably more and more exposed to potential epidemic and pandemic pathogens than we had been. That's partly to do with processes like deforestation, processes like climate change, that bring humans and animal populations into contact when they wouldn't necessarily have had contact otherwise. But also things like increases in air travel means that it is now possible for an infection to travel the whole circumference of the globe in a matter of 24 hours. And so containing the spread of these infections is much, much harder. Next slide, please. So coronavirus itself, the current strain that's causing the COVID-19 pandemic is known as SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses are around normally. There are, I think it's 5 or 6 circulating strains that cause things much akin to the common cold in the human population. So it's not that we never encounter them, but they are different enough, the different strains of the virus, so that we don't have what they would call sort of neutralizing immunity from having been exposed to a different type of coronavirus in the past. The image on the left is one from the CDC, which just shows the ultrastructure of the virus. So the grey bit is the surface of the virus particle, and then the red blobs are the spike protein, which is the region of the virus that's used to attach to target cells and then help to initiate and mediate the infection. And it's believed that these spike proteins are probably most likely attaching to a receptor called ACE2 on the surface of human cells, and that the number of these ACE2 receptors may be a reason why some people get worse infections than others. It's one of the biggest RNA viruses around there, so it has an RNA genome, and it's a single strand of RNA, much like things like polio virus and foot and mouth virus are, but it's about 3 times the size of those. And so it makes a number of proteins that it needs for infection, and that it needs to be able to create new viruses to spread that infection. But it does a lot of the replication of the virus happens by using the host's own enzymes and own machineries within the cell. Next slide, please. And you can just play the video. So this is just picking up on the number of cases of coronavirus in the current pandemic, starting from the very end of last year and going up to yesterday. And it just highlights, it's only a selection of countries that I've put onto the graph to make it visible, but it just highlights how the numbers have increased and rapidly increase as infection takes hold. And at the moment, the likely outcome is that countries like Brazil and Russia and Mexico, who are sort of in the earlier stages of infectious spread and maybe don't have the same level of control mechanisms that some countries such as South Korea, for example, employed, are likely to see increasing levels of infection over the coming weeks and months. And this is just confirmed cases being shown here where they are test positive cases. There will be an awful lot of unconfirmed cases going around at the moment. So we can go to the next slide when it finishes this time. Thank you. The last thing I want to say on coronavirus is, sort of to address that question of will there be a vaccine? We hear on the news that hundreds, well, thousands most likely of scientists are working on trying to get a coronavirus vaccine to help us to fight the threat, to help us to essentially return to some degree of normal life. This data was from the end of April, and essentially it was indicating that there were in the region of 70 to 90, I think, different vaccines that were being researched. These are not ones that are in clinical trials, but these are different groups, different research groups around the world who are looking at the possibility of creating vaccines that could then be put into clinical trials and tested. Some of them are using the whole virus, and they're looking to essentially make it less able to be able to cause an infection. Some of them are using components of the virus and making it possible that we create an immune response against, for example, just the spike protein, so that the virus can't get into the cells it needs to infect. Some of them are using the genetic material from the virus as a way of creating an immune response. We don't know yet which, if any of these, will be the most successful, but we can hope that at some point over the next 12 to 18 months, something comes out of one or more of these studies that leads to the development of a vaccine. And my own view on that is that we are likely to get a vaccine in the relatively short term, so in that sort of 12 to 18 month period, but it might not be the most effective vaccine that could be produced. So it will provide some degree of protection, and then with a longer time frame, we will get a stronger, more effective vaccine. Next slide, please. So just the last point I want to make here is, you can look back through historical chronicles, and it's perfectly obvious that throughout history, infectious diseases have played a really important and intimate part of our own development as the human race. They have helped to topple empires, and they have helped to precipitate the arrivals of new ones. They have had profound impacts on the development of countries and on the life of individuals. We're not going to get rid of infectious diseases. They are going to be something that we are continuously exposed to, both pathogens that we're used to, but also new ones that we haven't seen before, like the current coronavirus pandemic. But we will continue to develop new treatments and to improve current treatments that help us to control the threat that these infections present, and to allow us to coexist alongside them. Next slide, please, Corey. So just before I take questions, I just wanted to flag up a selection of the courses that we offer at the Institute that sort of relate to and touch on some of the areas that I've covered this afternoon. Over the next few weeks, we're starting a virtual summer festival of learning. I have a course on there looking at infection and immunity. There are a few others there that will pick up on sort of science-related topics. We offer a range of postgraduate and undergraduate qualifications in biological sciences. These include things like science communication at the postgraduate level. We're also offering an undergraduate certificate in genetics and an undergraduate diploma in evolutionary biology through remote learning for the coming academic year. But the ones that I want to mention probably most in terms of their relevance to the things that we've discussed and I've touched on today are two new courses that we're offering for the first time in the coming academic year, both of which are undergraduate certificates, so they're taught at first year university level. One of them will cover immunology. It will look at the innate and the adaptive immune response. It will look at how the immune response contributes to health and disease, and it will also look in particular at the impact of the immune response in terms of cancer. And then a certificate in infectious diseases as well, where there will be three distinct units. The first one will deal with virus infection. The second one will pick up on bacterial infection. And the last one will look at parasitic and fungal infections. So, if you find or have found some of the ideas and the concepts that I've mentioned today interesting, please do look into those in a little bit more detail.